Sarah Miller walked into Callaway's feed store with a bruise on her pride and a proposal on her lips, and she didn't so much as blink when she said it. "I need a husband by Friday," she told the man stacking grain sacks in the corner. "You'll do." David Harris turned around slow, looked at her the way a man looks at a rattlesnake he ain't sure is dead yet. "You serious?" "Dead serious." He set the sack down, dusted off his hands. "All right," he said. "I'll do." If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and follow Sarah all the way to the end, because I promise you, nothing goes the way either of them planned. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Sarah Miller had buried her father on a Tuesday and received the legal notice on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning she had made up her mind. She walked into Callaway's feed store with her chin up and her hands steady, and she did not let herself think too hard about what she was about to do until the words were already out of her mouth. "Mr. Harris?" David Harris was stacking 50-pound grain sacks in the back corner like he had all the time in the world, which was fitting because he was the kind of man who moved like time had agreed to wait on him. He didn't turn around right away. He finished setting the sack down first. "Miss Miller." He turned, looked at her once. That was enough for him. "I need to speak with you," she said, "privately." He glanced around the empty store. "This is about as private as Millhaven gets." "Then I'll say it plain." She folded her hands in front of her. "I need a husband. By Friday. And I've decided you'll do." The silence that followed had weight to it. David Harris didn't laugh, didn't look offended, didn't do much of anything except study her, the way a man studies a problem he's trying to figure the edges of. "That's so," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father left me the Miller farm, 47 acres, 2 wells, a house that needs work but stands solid. The county assessor, a man by the name of Gerald Holt, has informed me that under the terms of the original land grant, the property cannot be held in a woman's name without a male co-signer or a husband of record. I have 30 days to comply, or the land reverts to county auction." She held his gaze. 30 days was 3 weeks ago. "You've got a week," he said. 6 days, actually. He looked at her for a long moment. "And you came to me." "I asked Thomas Reedy first," she said, because she had always believed in honesty, even when it was unflattering. "He said no. I asked Bill Cartwright after that. He wanted the land put in his name outright." A pause. "I told him what he could do with that idea." David's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You're a fair man, Mr. Harris. Everyone in Millhaven knows it. You don't drink to excess, you don't gamble, and you haven't got a mean word to say about anyone that I've ever heard tell of. That ain't exactly a ringing endorsement. It's the only one I've got to offer." She straightened. "I'm not asking for a real marriage. I'm asking for a legal one. You'd live on the property. I have room. You'd put your name on the deed as co-owner. In return, I'll give you half the harvest income for as long as the arrangement stands. When we dissolve it, you walk away with a fair wage for your time and your trouble. In writing, if you prefer." David Harris picked up his hat from the counter, turned it in his hands once, twice. "Miss Miller," he said slowly, "do you understand what you're asking?" "Completely. Because once a man puts his name on something out here, it doesn't come off easy. Not in this county. Not with Gerald Holt watching." "I know that. And you trust me." He said it the way he'd say it to himself, like he was checking a sum that didn't quite add up. Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "I trust your reputation. I trust that you're not a man who'd take advantage of a woman with her back against a wall. That'll do for now." Something moved across his face. Hard to name it. It wasn't quite a smile, and it wasn't quite sorrow, and it was gone before she could study it clearly. "All right, David Harris said. He set his hat back on his head. I'll do. Sarah had expected relief. What she got instead was a whole new wave of terror, which was probably fitting. They were married that Friday at the county courthouse, in front of Judge Warren Albee, who had the expression of a man who'd seen everything twice and stopped being surprised by any of it. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Sarah wore the good blue dress she'd worn to her father's funeral 4 days prior. David wore his cleanest shirt and kept his hat in his hands throughout, which she noticed because it struck her as respectful in a way she hadn't thought to anticipate. "Do you, David James Harris, take this woman?" "I do." Calm as weather. Judge Albee raised an eyebrow, looked at Sarah. "And do you, Sarah Catherine Miller?" "I do." She said it like she was signing a contract. Because she was. Outside the courthouse, the summer heat pressed down on them like something physical. Sarah squinted into the white Texas sky and felt the full weight of what she'd done settle across her shoulders. Married. To a man she'd spoken to maybe a dozen times in her life. A man whose favorite color she didn't know. A man who, for all she could tell, might snore like a freight train, or talk in his sleep, or take an hour in the privy every morning. "Well," she said. "Well," David agreed. They stood there a moment. Two strangers on the courthouse steps, with nothing between them but a judge's signature and 6 days of desperation. "I've got the east room ready for you," she said at last. "Good window. The mattress is new. My father never slept on it." "That's fine. I do breakfast at 6 and supper at 7. I don't expect you to keep those hours if they don't suit you. But that's when the food's hot." 6 and 7, he said. "I'll be there." She nodded, offered her hand the way she'd offer it to a new business partner. He shook it. His grip was solid and brief, and completely professional. "One more thing," she said, before she could stop herself. Thank you." The words came out smaller than she intended, rougher at the edges. "I know this isn't what you had planned for your Friday." He looked at her for just a beat longer than necessary. "Neither did you," he said. And then he picked up his bag from the courthouse step and walked toward the wagon she'd brought to carry them both home. The first week was the strangest of Sarah Miller's life, and that was saying something considerable. David Harris was not what she'd expected. She'd expected him to be present the way a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, occasionally useful, mostly background. What she got instead was a man who moved through her farm like he'd been studying it from a distance for years and was only now getting to put his hands on it. He fixed the fence along the east pasture on his second day, without being asked. She found him at it before sunrise, working by the gray early light, and stood at the window for a full minute trying to decide if it annoyed her. She decided it didn't. "He didn't have to do that," she said at breakfast. "Fence was down," he said. He poured his own coffee without reaching across her, ate his eggs without commenting on them, which was either approval or indifference. With David Harris, she was beginning to suspect they might be the same thing. "There's a section along the south field that's worse," she said, almost against her will. "I'll get to it." "You don't have to, Miss Miller." He set his fork down, looked at her level, no impatience in it. "I'm not a man who sits idle. If you've got things that need doing, I'll do them. That's not a favor. That's just how I am." She opened her mouth, closed it. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said, and picked his fork back up. She watched him for a moment longer than she meant to. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. She decided that was fine, either way. Gerald Holt came calling on the 9th day of their marriage. Sarah was in the garden when she heard the buggy, and she recognized the sound of Holt's horse, the way you recognize the sound of trouble before you can see it. She straightened slowly, dusted her hands on her apron, and set her jaw. Gerald Holt was a lean man with sharp eyes and county authority he wore like a second skin. He stepped down from the buggy with a folder of papers under his arm and looked at the farm the way a buyer looks at livestock he's already mentally purchased. Mrs. Harris. The name landed flat between them, strange and new. First time anyone had called her that. Mr. Holt. She kept her voice easy. Wasn't expecting you. Just a routine verification, he smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Making sure the paperwork's all in order. Marriage license, co-signature on the deed, county policy. Of course, she held his gaze. My husband has the paperwork. She said it clean and smooth, and she was proud of herself for that. My husband. Is he about? Right here, David's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him walking up from the barn, unhurried as always, hat in hand. He nodded once to Holt, acknowledgement without warmth, respect without submission. Mr. Harris. Holt's eyes moved over him, measuring the man, calculating. Got the deed paperwork? Got it. David reached into his breast pocket and produced the folded documents. Signed, dated, filed with the county clerk's office 3 days after the wedding. He held them out without comment. Holt took them, unfolded them, read slowly, longer than necessary. Sarah kept her hands still at her sides. Everything appears to be in order, Holt said at last. He refolded the papers with deliberate precision, handed them back. I do like to check personally, make sure these arrangements are legitimate. The words sat between them like smoke on still air. Is there something you'd like to ask me directly, Mr. Holt? David said. His voice was quiet, but it wasn't soft. Holt's eyes moved to him, held. Just doing my job, Mr. Harris. Then you've done it. David took one step forward, not threatening, just closing the distance enough to make a point. We appreciate you making the trip. Long way out on a hot day. It was a dismissal so polite, it left no room for argument. Holt stood there a beat, 2 men measuring each other across the summer heat, and then tucked his folder under his arm. Good day, Mrs. Harris. He said it to Sarah without looking at her. A parting jab, small and deliberate. Good day, she said. They watched his buggy roll down the lane until the dust swallowed it. Neither spoke until the sound of wheels faded into the dry summer air. He's going to come back, Sarah said. Probably, David agreed. He doesn't believe the marriage is real. No, David looked at her. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. What bothers me, she said, is that he's going to make trouble before he makes peace with it. David nodded, slow. Then we'd better be ready for it. She looked at him sideways. You stepped forward, she said, when you told him he'd done his job. You stepped toward him. You do that on purpose? He looked at her a long moment. Did it work? She almost smiled. It worked. Then I did it on purpose, he said, and walked back toward the barn. The trouble she hadn't accounted for arrived 2 days later, and it didn't come from Gerald Holt. It came from Margaret Hargrove. Margaret Hargrove was the bank manager's wife and the self-appointed conscience of Mill Haven, Texas. She made charity calls feel like indictments and arrived at the Miller farm. The Harris farm now, Sarah reminded herself, the thought still sitting sideways, with a basket of preserves and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Sarah. She stepped into the kitchen without being fully invited and set the basket on the table like she owned the surface. I heard about your arrangement. Wanted to come by and see how you were settling in. I'm settled fine. Sarah kept her voice pleasant. "Thank you for the preserves." "Of course." Margaret looked around the kitchen with the careful attention of a woman conducting an inventory. "It must be strange," she said, "taking in a boarder, dressing it up as a marriage." The words were light. The intent behind them was not. Sarah turned from the counter and looked at her directly. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "Oh, Margaret laughed, small and airy. "Everyone knows, Sarah, that you needed a name on that deed and found one quick enough. Nobody's judging, of course. A woman alone has to do what she can." "Does she?" Sarah said. "I just hope you know what you've gotten yourself into. David Harris is a fine enough man, but he's not—" She paused, choosing her words with deliberate care. "He's not the settling kind. He's been in Millhaven, 3, 4 years? Nobody really knows him. Where he came from, why he left wherever that was." She picked up a jam jar from the basket, as if examining her own handiwork. "Men like that don't put down roots, Sarah. They move on." The kitchen door opened. David Harris stepped inside, holding a repaired leather harness in one hand. He stopped when he saw Margaret. Looked at Sarah once, quick, reading her, and then crossed to the door hook and hung the harness on it, like a man who had every right to be exactly where he was. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, politely enough. "Mr. Harris," Margaret straightened, jar still in hand, recalculating something behind her eyes. "Just telling Sarah how pleased everyone is for you both," she said. "Is that right?" He moved to the counter, poured a cup of water, and then, in a gesture so natural that Sarah nearly let it pass without registering, he stopped behind her chair and rested one hand briefly on her shoulder. "Just a moment. Just wait. Just enough." "Real pleased," he said easily. "What kind of preserves did you bring?" Margaret blinked, set the jar down. "Strawberry." Sarah's favorite. He said it without looking at Sarah. Said it the way a man says something he's known long enough that it doesn't need announcing. Sarah hadn't told him that. It also wasn't true. She preferred peach. But something about the certainty in his voice, the quiet ownership of that small detail, made the whole room feel different. Made them feel different. Like something that had been constructed on paper was suddenly standing on its own foundation. Margaret left 20 minutes later, with considerably less to say than she'd arrived with. Sarah waited until the sound of the buggy faded. Then she turned to him. "I prefer peach," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The preserves. Strawberry isn't my favorite. Peach is." Something shifted in his expression. The beginning of a smile that didn't quite land. "I'll remember that," he said. "You made it up. The strawberry." I said what seemed useful. He set his cup in the basin. She was working up to something mean. Figured I'd cut her off before she got there. Sarah studied him for a moment. He held her gaze without flinching, without apology, like a man who'd done what needed doing and didn't see the profit in discussing it afterward. "You didn't have to do that," she said, for the second time in as many weeks. He tilted his head slightly. "Fence was down," he said, again. She understood then that this was something he did, reduced complex acts of protection to their plainest utility, stripped the sentiment clean out of them so they couldn't be refused or argued with. It was either the most practical thing she'd ever witnessed, or the most quietly kind. She was beginning to suspect it was both. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table long after supper was cleared away and the lamp had burned low. She had her father's ledger open in front of her, columns of figures, 30 years of careful accounting in her father's cramped, honest handwriting. And she was looking for the number that told her she'd made the right decision. the number that said the farm was worth what it had cost her. She was still looking when David came through on his way to bed. He stopped, looked at the ledger, looked at her face. "Trouble?" he said. "No." She ran her finger down a column of figures. "Just thinking." "About what?" She didn't answer right away. The lamp flame bent in a breath of summer air through the open window. "My father built this farm out of nothing," she said at last. 30 years. Every post, every plank, every row of that south field. He did it alone, and then he did it for me. And when he died, he left it to me, because he believed I could hold it." She paused. "I don't intend to fail him." David pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't speak for a moment. "What kind of man was he?" he said. It wasn't the response she'd expected. "Quiet," she said. "Stubborn. Fair. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And he never once looked at me like I was anything less than exactly what he'd hoped for." Her voice held steady. She was proud of that. "He was the best man I ever knew." David was quiet. "Then hold the farm," he said. "That's all the answer you need." It was the simplest thing. It was also, somehow, exactly the right thing. She looked at him across the table. This stranger she'd married in 11 minutes. This man who'd fixed her fences without being asked, and defended her with a hand on her shoulder and a jar of strawberry preserves. And something shifted in her chest. Not love. Not yet. But the first small movement toward it. Like a door she hadn't known was closed, being pushed open just enough to let the air through. "Good night, Mr. Harris," she said. "Good night, Miss Miller," he said. He stood, pushed the chair back in, careful not to scrape it, and went to bed. She sat a while longer, looked at the ledger, looked at the empty chair across from her. For the first time since her father died, she did not feel entirely alone. On the 15th day of their marriage, a letter arrived from a law office in Denver, Colorado. Sarah saw it first. She stood at the front door with the envelope in her hand and read the return address twice to make sure she wasn't mistaken. The firm's name meant nothing to her. The letter inside was addressed to both of them. Mr. and Mrs. David Harris, which was the first time she'd seen her new name written in a stranger's handwriting. And under these circumstances, it didn't sit well. She read it standing in the full summer heat. When she finished, she read it again. The letter stated that a formal complaint had been filed with the Colorado Territory Land Office. Millhaven fell within its jurisdiction, alleging that the Harris marriage had been entered into solely to circumvent the provisions of the original land grant, thereby rendering the deed transfer invalid. The land office had 60 days to investigate the claim. During that period, the property was to be considered legally contested, and no transfers, sales, or improvements of record could be made. Contested. She was still standing in the doorway when David came around from the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her face, crossed the distance between them in a few unhurried strides, and took the letter she held out without a word. Read it through once, thorough, quiet, expression giving nothing away. When he finished, he looked up. "Holt," he said. "Has to be," she said. "Nobody else had cause or connections." He filed a formal complaint with Denver. He filed a formal complaint with Denver. She heard the steadiness in her own voice and was almost surprised by it, because underneath it, she was not afraid. She was furious. Clean, cold, righteous furious, in the way her father used to get when something decent was treated with contempt. 60 days, she said. 60 days while a land office in Denver that has never set foot in Millhaven decides whether my marriage is real enough to satisfy their records. David folded the letter carefully along its original creases, looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to fight it." No hesitation, no qualifier, no hedging. "I want to fight it, and I want to win. And I want Gerald Holt to understand that I am not a woman who can be pushed off her father's land by paperwork and spite." Something moved in David Harris's face then. Something that looked, for just a moment, very much like admiration. The real kind, not the polished social kind. The kind that catches a man off guard and shows before he can decide whether to let it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And just like that, the arrangement changed. What had been a practical contract between two practical people became something more urgent. Something that had edges to it. Something that required them to stand on the same side of a line neither of them had drawn. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it shift beneath them, the way the ground shifts before a storm arrives. Subtle, certain, and impossible to walk back from. The summer pressed on, hot and relentless, full of everything that was still to come. They hired a lawyer on a Monday. His name was Edmund Price, and he operated out of a narrow office above the Millhaven post office that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had fought too many battles on behalf of people who couldn't afford to win them. He was not young. He was not inspiring to look at. But his eyes were sharp in a way that mattered. And when Sarah laid the Denver letter on his desk and watched him read it, he didn't wince, which she took as a good sign. "Holt," Price said when he finished. Not a question. "That's what we believe," David said. "He's got connections at the land office. Nothing provable, but everybody in this county knows it." Price set the letter down, laced his fingers together. "The complaint itself is thin, circumstantial. They'd need to demonstrate that the marriage was entered into with no intent of genuine cohabitation, which is a harder thing to prove than most people think, especially if you're actually living together on the property." "We are," Sarah said. "Same house, same table, same farm." "Good." Price looked at her over the top of his folded hands. "Then the question becomes how we document that. Witnesses. Neighbors who can speak to the reality of the arrangement. Letters. Records." "Neighbors," David said slowly. "2 or 3 solid ones. People whose word carries weight in this county." Sarah thought of Margaret Hargrove, dismissed the thought immediately. "I'll find them," she said. Price nodded. "I'll draft the response to Denver. Give me a week." He picked up his pen, paused. "Mrs. Harris." He said the name with careful precision, the way a man says something he means to establish. "This is winnable, but it requires that the two of you present a unified front. No gaps, no contradictions, no ammunition for Holt to use. You understand?" "Completely," Sarah said. David said nothing. He was looking at a point somewhere past Price's left shoulder, the way he looked when he was working something out internally that he hadn't decided to share yet. Sarah had learned, in 2 weeks, that this was a signal worth watching. They walked out of Price's office into the full fury of a Texas July. The heat hit them like a wall, dense and merciless, the kind that made the air above the packed dirt street shimmer like water. "What are you thinking?" she said. "Holt didn't file that complaint because he believes our marriage is fake," David said. "He filed it because someone told him to." She stopped walking, turned to face him fully. "Who?" "Don't know yet." His eyes moved down the street in that quiet, reading way. "But a county assessor doesn't start correspondence with a Denver law office on his own initiative over one deed filing. That costs money, and it costs time. Someone wanted this filed, and it wasn't Holt." The implications of that settled over her, slow and cold, despite the summer heat. "Someone else wants the land," she said. "Someone who knew exactly which legal mechanism to use," he said, "and who to use it through." She stood there a moment, the sun pressing down on the crown of her head, and felt something she hadn't felt since the morning after her father died. The vertiginous sense that the ground she was standing on was not as solid as she'd been told. "Then we need to find out who," she said. "We do," he agreed. Neither of them moved right away. They stood there on the board sidewalk of Millhaven's Main Street, two people bound together by paper and necessity, looking at a problem that was larger and older than either of them had assumed. Then David picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it and settled it back on his head, and Sarah straightened her spine, and they walked back toward the wagon together. The first witness came from a direction Sarah hadn't anticipated. Her name was Ruth Callan, and she was 63 years old and had known Sarah's father since before Sarah was born. She showed up at the farm on a Wednesday morning with a pie and an expression that suggested she hadn't come for pleasantries. "I heard about the Denver business," Ruth said, settling herself at the kitchen table like a woman who intended to stay until things were decided. "Holt's been running his mouth at the general store. Said your marriage was a scheme and that the county ought to take the land before you run it into debt." Sarah set 2 cups of coffee on the table. Her jaw was tight. He said that where people could hear him? Said it where he intended for people to hear him. Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. "Which is different and worse." She looked at Sarah straight on. "I'm willing to testify. In writing, in court, whatever Mr. Price needs." "I've known you since you were 4 years old, Sarah Miller, and I know your father built that farm with his hands and his heart. I won't sit quiet while Gerald Holt takes it for spite." Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. "Thank you," she said. The words came out too small again. They always came out too small for things that mattered this much. "Don't thank me yet." Ruth glanced toward the window. "Where's your husband?" "Southfield." Ruth nodded, slow. The kind of nod that meant she was thinking something she hadn't fully committed to saying. "What is it?" Sarah said. "People are talking," Ruth said. "Not all of it's kind. There are those in town who have decided this arrangement of yours is convenient. And they're watching, waiting for something that proves them right." "Let them watch," Sarah said. "I intend to." Ruth sipped her coffee. "Just making sure you know the stakes." Sarah knew the stakes. She'd known them the moment she'd walked into Callaway's feed store and made a proposal that had no graceful way to fail. What she hadn't known, what she was beginning to understand in slow, accumulating increments, was that the stakes kept changing shape. What had begun as land and a deed and a legal formality was becoming something that involved her name, her father's memory, her standing in a town she'd lived in her whole life. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, there was a man in her south field who had stepped forward when Gerald Holt smiled like a snake, and who had said strawberry with the confidence of a man who had decided, somewhere quiet and private, that he was going to mean it. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she poured more coffee for Ruth Callan, and she listened, and she filed away what needed filing, and she kept moving. David came back from the south field that evening with dirt on his boots and something on his face that didn't sit right. Sarah saw it the moment he came through the door. Set down the dish she was drying. Waited. "I ran into Caleb Pierce out by the property line," he said. He went to the basin, washed his hands. Methodical. He was measuring. Measuring what? The fence line, the boundary posts. He turned around, drying his hands on the cloth she'd left by the basin. With a surveying instrument. Sarah stared at him. He was surveying my property? He said he was doing county work. David's voice was neutral, in the specific way that meant he didn't believe what he was repeating. Said it was routine. Caleb Pierce works for the county assessor's office. She set the dish on the counter. He works for Holt. I know. They're trying to resurvey the boundary lines. She understood it in one clean pull, all the pieces landing. If they can shift the recorded measurements, even by a small margin, they can challenge the original grant description and open the whole title to dispute. David looked at her. In 2.5 weeks, she had surprised him exactly twice. The first time was in Callaway's feed store. The second time was now. That's what I thought, he said. David, it was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. attached. Neither of them acknowledged it. If they refile the survey records before Price can respond to Denver, we lose the foundation of the entire defense. Everything that confirms this is Miller land, the original boundaries, the grant description, the recorded acreage, all of it comes into question. I sent Pierce back to the road, David said. Told him the property was posted against trespassing, and I'd enforce it. Can you do that? I did it. He set the cloth down. Whether I can or not seemed like a question to answer later. She almost laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to find the edge of laughter in the middle of this. We need to get to Price first thing tomorrow, she said. My thought exactly, he said. They ate supper fast and without much talking, the way two people eat when they're thinking hard about the same problem and have agreed without words to let each other work through it. She noticed him refilling her coffee cup without being asked. She noticed herself passing him the bread before he reached for it. Small synchronicities, domestic and unremarkable, and somehow, in the accumulation of them, not unremarkable at all. Price was at his desk before they arrived the next morning, which meant he'd already heard. Pierce was surveying your south line yesterday, he said the moment they walked in. We know, David said. I've filed an emergency injunction to halt any county survey work on the Miller property, pending resolution of the Denver complaint. Price spread papers across his desk with the controlled urgency of a man working against a clock he could hear but not see. Judge Albee signed it this morning. That buys us 30 days, maybe 40 if Holt decides to challenge it, which will cost him time he can't easily spare. Good, Sarah said. What else? I need something else from you. Price looked at them both, leaned forward. The Denver office is going to want evidence that this is a genuine marriage, not just cohabitation. Proof of a functioning partnership. Joint decisions, shared accounts, witnesses who can speak to the relationship directly. David's expression didn't change. Sarah kept hers equally still. What kind of witnesses? She said. People who've seen you together, interacting like a married couple, not performing, actually functioning as partners. He paused. That's a different thing, Mrs. Harris, and it's the thing that wins this. She looked at David. He was already looking at her. For a moment, they just held that, the two of them, in the small office above the post office, with Edmund Price watching them both. And something moved in that look, something unnamed, something that had been building in the spaces between the practical decisions and the fixed fences, and the cup of coffee placed without asking, and the name used without the Mr. Something that had been waiting for a large enough moment to make itself visible. We understand, David said. His voice was even. His eyes were still on hers. Good. Price gathered his papers. Because Holt is going to push this hard, and I want to push back harder. But that only works if what I'm defending is real. Neither of them replied to that. They walked out of Price's office and into the heat of a Texas morning. And this time, neither of them spoke for almost a full block. The street moved around them. Wagons and foot traffic and the ordinary loud life of a small town on a summer day. and they moved through it side by side, close enough that their arms nearly touched. "He's right," Sarah said finally. "I know," David said. "We've been—" She stopped, started again. "We've been practical, efficient. But if someone is watching for gaps—" "Then we close the gaps," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "What does that look like to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "It looks like what we've been doing," he said slowly, "except without as much pretending that we don't notice it." She let that sit. It sat in an interesting place. "You've noticed it," she said. It wasn't entirely a question. He stopped walking. She stopped too. They stood in the middle of the board sidewalk, like two people who had arrived somewhere neither of them had specifically been heading. "Miss Miller," he said, then stopped, started again. "Sarah," this time deliberate. "I'm not a man who gets confused about what he's feeling. I know what I think, and I know when I've changed my mind about something." She waited. "I came into this as a practical matter," he said. "I told myself it would stay that way." "And?" she said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the first fence he'd fixed, like a man who had already decided what needed doing and was only now explaining his reasoning to someone who'd asked. "And Peach," he said. She blinked. "I'll remember Peach," he said. "Next time someone brings preserves, I'll say Peach without thinking, and I won't be making it up." Something tightened in her chest, not painfully, the opposite of that. "That's not the same as saying what you mean," she said, because she needed to be sure. "I know." He held her gaze steady. "I'm working up to that part." She nodded, slow, once. "Work faster," she said. "We've got a Denver law office to fight." Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the careful quiet of it, something warm and surprised and entirely genuine. And for a moment, David Harris looked younger than she'd ever seen him look. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And they walked back to the wagon, together. The second witness came from the last place Sarah expected. Randall Mott was 61 years old, had run the Millhaven General Store for 30 years, and had the distinction of having spoken fewer unnecessary words than any man Sarah had ever known. He came to the farm on a Thursday afternoon, hat in hand, and stood in her doorway the way a man stands when he's decided to do something uncomfortable and has committed to seeing it through. "Mrs. Harris." He nodded once. "Got a minute?" She had several, as it turned out, because what Randall Mott said in the next 20 minutes rewrote the shape of everything she thought she understood. He'd overheard a conversation, 3 weeks back, in the rear storeroom of his own shop, through the wall between his office and the alley. Gerald Holt's voice, and another voice he hadn't recognized, talking about the Miller property. Talking about the land office connection. Talking about a buyer who'd offered a sum that made Randall go very still on his side of the wall. Because it was the kind of sum that didn't come from individuals. It came from railroad men. "Railroad," David said. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table and did not move, but something in him went taut and attentive, in a way Sarah had learned to recognize. "I don't know which line," Randall said. They weren't specific, but the way they talked about the location, near the eastern ridge, good grade for a rail bed, water access from the Miller wells. It wasn't casual. This wasn't speculation. This was planning. Sarah's mind went perfectly quiet for one long second. Then it went very loud. "They want my land for a rail line," she said. "The eastern portion of it, near as I could tell," Randall said. "Enough to make the rest of the acreage difficult to work. And if the marriage is dissolved, the land goes to auction," David said. "And a railroad company with county connections wins that auction before the hammer drops," Sarah said. Randall nodded. He had the expression of a man who had spent 3 weeks deciding whether what he knew was his business to share, and had finally concluded that it was. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked him, not unkindly, but she needed to know. "Because your father sold me credit for 2 months when I first opened that store," Randall said. "Because your father shook my hand like I was worth something, when half this town thought I was a fool with a business plan and no money. And because Gerald Holt has been eating lunch at his desk and smiling to himself for 3 weeks. And I don't like what that smile means." He left without the coffee she'd offered. He had what he'd come to do, and Randall Mott had never been a man who stayed longer than necessary. Sarah sat at the table after the door closed. David sat across from her. The late afternoon pressed through the window between them, and neither spoke for a long moment. "Railroad money," she said. "That's who filed the complaint." "Railroad money through Holt," he said, "which means this isn't a county matter anymore. This is business, and business fights differently than spite does." "How?" "It's patient," he said. "It waits. It files paperwork. It resurveys boundary lines. It sends polite letters from Denver." He leaned forward. "And it keeps pressure on until the thing it wants costs less to give up than to fight for." She looked at him directly. "Do you think I'm going to give up?" "No," he said, without hesitation, without qualification. "I don't think that at all." She nodded, drew a slow breath. "Then we take this to Price and we tell him everything. Holt, the railroad connection, Randall's testimony. We build the case from the ground up, and we build it to last." "That's a fight that could go 6 months," he said. "Maybe more." "Then it goes 6 months." She held his gaze. "This is my father's land, David, and I have not run out of things to fight with." He looked at her a long moment. That look again. The one that made her feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Nothing to do with the arrangement. Nothing to do with what was practical or legal or necessary. "No," he said quietly. "You haven't." Outside, the summer heat finally began to ease toward evening. That brief, forgiving hour when Texas air loses its worst edge and smells for a moment like something that could be survived. Sarah Harris, sat across the table from the man she had married in 11 minutes, and chosen again every day since, in ways neither of them had named yet. She was going to fight for this land. She was beginning to understand she was fighting for something else, too. Price went still when they told him about the railroad. Not the stillness of a man caught off guard. The stillness of a man who had suspected something, and was now being handed confirmation he'd hoped wouldn't come. He set his pen down very carefully on the edge of his desk, and looked at the space between them for a long moment before he spoke. "Which line?" he said. Randall didn't know, David said. They weren't specific. "But the eastern ridge," Price said. "The grade. The water access." That's what he heard. Price stood, moved to the narrow window that looked out over the main street, stayed there with his back to them, and Sarah watched his shoulders carry the weight of something he was working out. "There's been talk," he said finally, "for about a year now. Quiet talk. The kind that moves through back rooms and courthouse hallways and doesn't land in newspapers. A rail expansion out of San Antonio. New route, new territory. Some men got very interested in certain parcels of land along the projected path." He turned around. "I didn't know the Miller property was on that path." "Is that a problem?" Sarah said. "It changes what we're dealing with." Price came back to the desk, planted both hands on it. "This isn't Gerald Holt being spiteful, Mrs. Harris. This is a corporation using Holt as an instrument. They have lawyers in 4 states, political connections in Austin and Denver both, and enough money to fight a land case until the person they're fighting runs out of resources." He paused. "That is the strategy. Wear you down. Make it expensive enough that settling costs less than continuing. The room was very quiet. "Tell me something I haven't already figured out," Sarah said. Price looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something that might have been respect under different circumstances, and under these circumstances was exactly that. "Randall Mott's testimony changes the nature of our defense," he said. "We're no longer just proving the marriage is legitimate. We're demonstrating a coordinated scheme to defraud a private landowner through the abuse of county authority. That's a different case. That's a case that gets filed against Holt personally, and against whoever is directing him." "Can you build that case?" David said. "I can start it." Price straightened. "But I need Randall in writing. Signed, witnessed, notarized. I need it this week, before anyone gets wind that he's talking." "I'll get it today," Sarah said. "There's one more thing." Price hesitated, and Edmund Price was not a man who hesitated lightly. "If the railroad is behind this, they will escalate when they see we're fighting back. They've been patient because they expected this to be easy. The moment they understand it isn't, the pressure is going to increase in ways I may not be able to anticipate." He looked at both of them, one and then the other. "I need to know that you're both committed to seeing this through, all the way through." Sarah looked at David. He was already looking at her. "We're committed," she said. Randall Mott signed the statement that same afternoon. His handwriting was plain and deliberate, and read like the man himself. No flourishes, no hedging, just the facts laid down in the order they'd happened. Sarah sat across from him at his desk in the back of the general store while he wrote. And she watched his face, and she thought about her father, about the kind of quiet decency that doesn't announce itself, about how it was always the people who said the least, who showed up when it mattered most. She was back at the farm by 4 o'clock. David was on the porch. He had a piece of tack leather in his hands he'd been working on for the last 2 days, and he looked up when she came up the steps, the way he always looked up, fully, without pretending he hadn't heard her coming. "Done," she said. "Good." He set the leather aside. "How's Randall?" "Steady. He said to tell you the fence work you did along the east property line made the boundary look clearer than it has in years." She paused. "He thinks that might matter." "It might," David said. She sat down on the step beside him. Not across from him, not opposite him. The side. It was the first time she'd done that. He didn't make note of it, but she felt the quality of his silence change the way a room changes when someone opens a window. "Price thinks they'll escalate," she said. "Price is right." "What do you think that looks like?" He was quiet a moment, turned the leather over in his hands without looking at it. "They'll try to separate us," he said. "Find a crack and work it. Make one of us doubt the other." She looked at him sideways. "Is there a crack to find?" He met her eyes. His were dark and level and gave very little away, except in this moment, right now, they were giving away something. "Not if I can help it," he said. She held his gaze for a beat. Then she looked back at the lane. The summer evening was coming in low and golden, and the farm looked the way it looked in her best memories of it, whole and hers, and worth every hard thing she'd done to keep it. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something real." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I had a place once," he said. "Not here. Up in Colorado Territory. Small operation, 30 acres, a creek. I worked it for 4 years. "What happened to it?" "Legal trouble." His voice was steady. "A neighbor disputed the boundary, said my fence was wrong, my deed was wrong. Filed with the county. County agreed." He paused. "I didn't have a price. Didn't have a Ruth Callan or a Randall Mott. I fought it alone for a year, and then I couldn't fight it anymore." Sarah went very still. "You lost it," she said. I lost it. He said it clean, the way you say something you've made your peace with, even though the peace cost you. Walked away with my horse and 2 months of wages. Came south. Ended up in Millhaven. She understood something then that she hadn't understood before. Understood it in the full weight of it. Why he'd said yes in that feed store without needing to think about it. Why he'd fixed the fence without being asked. Why he'd stepped toward Gerald Holt on her porch without hesitation. He knew exactly what she was fighting for. He'd already lost the version of it that was his. "David," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkind. "I didn't tell you for sympathy. I told you because you asked for something real, and that's real." She nodded, let it sit where he'd put it. "Then I'm glad you're here," she said, "for what it's worth." He looked at her, long enough that it meant something. "It's worth a good deal," he said quietly. The letter from Denver arrived on a Thursday, and it arrived with company. Sarah saw the writer first, not a postal rider, a private courier, well dressed in the way that meant someone with money was paying for the service. He handed her an envelope at the front gate, tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, and rode back the way he'd come before she'd finished reading the address. The envelope contained 2 letters. The first was from the Denver Land Office, formal language, official seal, informing them that the investigation was proceeding and that both parties were required to present testimony before a land office representative who would be dispatched to Millhaven in 14 days. Required, not requested. She read it twice. Then she opened the second letter. It was from a man named Cornelius Webb. His letterhead identified him as a senior legal representative of the Southwestern Territorial Railroad Consortium. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and very polite, and made her want to put her fist through the kitchen wall. It offered to purchase the Miller property, all 47 acres, including both wells and all improvements, at a price that was generous by any calculation. It noted that this offer would remain open for 30 days. It expressed, in language so carefully chosen it could not technically be called a threat, the sincere hope that the current legal dispute over the property's title would not cause either party undue difficulty, and suggested that a sale would, of course, render such disputes moot. David read it standing at the counter. She watched his face. "They're not even waiting for the hearing," she said. "They're giving you a way out before one." He set the letter down. "Clean offer. Generous price. No admission of what they've done." "They think I'll take it." "They think most people would take it." He looked up at her. "What do you want to do?" She picked up the letter, read it one more time, slow, every polished word of it. Then she set it down again. "I want to hand this to Price," she said, "because a railroad company sending a purchase offer to a landowner whose title they have a pending legal action against through proxies is not a coincidence. It's coordination. And Price is going to know exactly what to do with it." David looked at her for a moment. That look again. The one that had stopped being nameless somewhere around the second week of July and had acquired a name neither of them had spoken aloud yet. "You know," he said, "for a woman who claims to be practical, I am practical," she said. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," he finished. She almost smiled. "Is that a complaint?" He picked up his hat. "No," he said. "It's not." Price's reaction to the Webb letter was the most animated Sarah had seen him. He read it once. Then he sat down. Then he stood back up. Then he read it again. "They sent this to you directly?" he said. "Yesterday, while there is an active land office investigation pending." He set the letter on the desk like it was something fragile. "Mrs. Harris, This is either the most arrogant thing I've seen in 30 years of law, or they are so certain of their political coverage that they don't believe anyone can touch them. Which is it? David said. Both. Price looked at them. And that's exactly what makes it useful. Because this letter, combined with Randall's testimony, establishes a direct line between the land office complaint and a private financial interest. That is not how legal disputes work in this country. That is how corruption works. He was already reaching for paper. I'm filing an amended complaint with the land office today. We are no longer the party being investigated. The railroad and Gerald Holt are. Sarah sat down. She hadn't realized she'd been standing on a kind of internal tension for days until it broke slightly. Just at the edges. Just enough. Will it work? She said. It will make a great deal of noise, Price said. And sometimes noise is all you need to make the other side reconsider the cost of continuing. The hearing was set for a Friday. The land office representative was a man named Thomas Greer, sent from Denver with a briefcase and the expression of a man who had been dispatched to resolve an inconvenience and expected to be back on a train by Monday. He was not unpleasant. He was not particularly warm. He had 2 piles of documents and a courtroom that Millhaven Civic Center had been temporarily repurposed to provide, and he called the session to order at 9 in the morning with the brisk economy of a man on a schedule. Gerald Holt sat on one side with a lawyer Sarah didn't recognize. Young, sharp-suited, the kind of man who traveled with railroad money. Sarah and David sat on the other side with Price. She had worn her good dress again, not the blue one she'd worn to her father's funeral, and not the one she'd worn to the courthouse wedding. A different one, green, her mother's color, the one she kept for things that mattered. She did not examine too closely why that distinction had seemed important this morning. David had worn his cleanest shirt and left his hat at the farm, and when he'd come downstairs and found her standing in the kitchen in the green dress, he'd gone very still for a moment, in a way she'd carried with her into the hearing room. Greer opened the session by reviewing the formal complaint. Sarah listened to the language of it. Fraudulent circumvention, unlawful transfer of title, marriage of convenience, and felt her jaw go tight in a way she had to consciously release. Then Price stood. He laid the case out in the methodical, accumulating way of a man who had spent his whole career understanding that truth was most effective when presented without drama. Randall Mott's testimony. The survey crew on the property line. The timeline of Holt's filing relative to the railroad's interest in the Eastern Ridge. And then, last, deliberate, placed where it would land hardest, the Webb letter. The sharp-suited railroad lawyer sat up straighter when Price read the date on the Webb offer. Sarah watched him. Holt leaned toward his lawyer and said something under his breath. The lawyer shook his head once, small and sharp. Greer read the letter himself, read it again, set it down on his pile with the careful attention of a man reclassifying something. This offer was made, Greer said slowly, while the complaint was active. 14 days after it was filed, yes, Price said, through a representative of the Southwestern Territorial Railroad Consortium, the entity with a documented financial interest in the land in question. Objection, the railroad lawyer said. The consortium's interest in regional development is not the objection, Greer said flatly. Sit down. The lawyer sat down. Holt did not look at Sarah. She watched him not look at her. Greer asked 3 questions. Price answered 2 of them. David answered the third. His voice steady and even, no performance in it, just a man telling what he knew because he was asked, and he believed in saying what was true. Sarah watched the representative's face while David spoke, and she saw the moment the man made up his mind. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a small one, a slight settling, a tilt of the head, a pen picked up. but she'd been watching carefully. When Greer called a recess, the railroad lawyer was on his feet in seconds and moving toward Holt with the look of a man managing a liability. Sarah watched them in the corner of the room. Low voices, clipped gestures, Holt's expression shifting from confident to something that looked considerably more like concern. "They're recalculating," David said quietly beside her. She kept her eyes on Holt. "Good." "Price looks like a man who's won something," David said. "He hasn't won yet," she said. "No," David agreed. "But he knows he's going to." The recess lasted 20 minutes. When Greer reconvened, he announced that, in light of the documentary evidence presented, the Land Office investigation would be formally redirected to examine the conduct of the County Assessor's Office in relation to the complaint's filing, and that the Miller property title dispute would be suspended pending that examination. All survey activity on the property was hereby enjoined. The railroad lawyer began drafting something the moment Greer stopped speaking. Holt stared at the table in front of him, with the particular stillness of a man understanding, for the first time, that he'd been used and was now the piece being discarded. Sarah felt the relief move through her, not a flood, not a collapse, more like a long-held breath finally allowed to leave. She kept her hands folded on the table, kept her back straight. She would not give Gerald Holt the satisfaction of watching her come apart with relief. But under the table, she felt David's hand move to the back of her chair. Not touching her, just there, present, an inch of space between his hand and her back, and she felt it more than she would have felt contact. She turned her head slightly, just enough. He was looking straight ahead, but the corner of his mouth had the particular quality of a man keeping something carefully contained. She looked forward again. Outside the Civic Center windows, Millhaven went about its morning. The ordinary world, indifferent to what had just shifted inside this room. The bearing hadn't finished. There were papers to sign and language to agree on, and Price's careful navigation of the formal records still to come. But something had broken open today, and it wasn't just the railroad's case. Sarah knew it. She suspected David knew it too, and was applying the same controlled patience to that knowledge that he applied to everything. Working it quietly, not rushing it, trusting that the right thing done in the right order tends to hold. She hoped he would work faster. He'd said he was working up to it. She was running out of patience for working up to things. She'd spent 6 weeks being practical, and she was not sorry for a single day of it. But she was beginning to feel, with increasing and specific urgency, that practicality had a ceiling, and she was standing very close to it now. And what was on the other side of it was something she didn't have a ledger entry for. Her father had built the farm post by post, plank by plank, row by row. She was beginning to think she was building something too. She wasn't entirely sure she was afraid of that anymore. The papers took 3 days to finalize. 3 days of Price's careful language, the Land Office's formal correspondence, the railroad lawyer's increasingly terse replies. And through all of it, Sarah and David returned to the farm each evening and ate supper and said practical things to each other about practical matters. And the thing that had cracked open in the hearing room sat between them like a window neither of them had yet decided to climb through. On the 4th day, Price sent word that the formal suspension of the title dispute had been entered into the county record. The Miller property, all 47 acres, both wells, every post David had fixed, and every row her father had turned, was legally, officially, uncontestably hers. She stood in Price's office and read the document twice, and she did not cry, which she considered a significant personal achievement. "It's not over," Price said, because he was Price, and he was constitutionally incapable of delivering good news without the full context. The Land Office examination of Holt's conduct will continue. The railroad may pursue alternative routes, or they may regroup and try a different approach in 6 months. I've advised keeping your records current and your boundary posts clear. I understand, she said, but the immediate threat is resolved. He allowed himself one small nod, the price equivalent of a celebration. You held it, Mrs. Harris. She looked at the document in her hand. Her father's name in the original grant language, her name beneath it on the current filing. David's name beside hers, clean and legal and permanent. We held it, she said. David was at the south fence when she got back. She didn't call out to him. She walked across the field in the afternoon heat until she was close enough that he heard her coming and straightened and turned, and she held out the document without saying anything. He took it, read it through, handed it back. Done, he said. Done, she said. They stood there a moment in the full press of the Texas afternoon. A hawk moved overhead, slow and unhurried, and the dry grass bent in a breath of wind, and that was all. My father would have liked you, Sarah said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things come out when you've been holding them long enough, without permission, without ceremony. David looked at her. He didn't deflect it or minimize it the way she'd half expected. He just received it. Tell me more about him, he said. She did. Standing there at the south fence line, in the heat of late July, she told David about her father. The stories she hadn't told anyone because no one had asked. Because grief has a way of making people uncomfortable with the specific details of who someone was. She told him about the summer her father taught her to read a land survey, about the morning he'd stood with her at this same fence line, and told her that the most valuable thing a person could own was something they'd built themselves. About the way he laughed, sudden and surprised, like it caught him off guard every time. David listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer parallel stories, didn't try to fill the silences. He just listened, the way he did everything, fully, with his whole attention. When she finished, she felt something had been set down that she'd been carrying without realizing the weight of it. He sounds like a man worth missing, David said. He was. She looked at the fence. You've been fixing things he built. I know. Does that feel strange? He considered it honestly. No, he said. It feels like the right use of time. She nodded. Let that sit where he'd put it. Somewhere in the region of her chest, the ceiling she'd been running up against felt significantly higher than it had this morning. Margaret Hargrove came to call that Saturday, and this time she came with the full weight of changed circumstances and the particular discomfort of a woman who had said things she could no longer afford to have said. Sarah saw her coming up the lane and felt neither dread nor satisfaction. Mostly she felt tired, in the clean way you're tired after something hard is finished. Mrs. Harris. Margaret was formal in a way she hadn't been before, which was its own kind of apology. I wanted to offer my congratulations on the legal resolution. Thank you, Margaret. Sarah stepped back from the door. Come in. Coffee's on. Margaret came in, sat where she always sat, folded her hands on the table the way women fold their hands when they've rehearsed something. I owe you an apology, she said. Sarah poured 2 cups, set them down, sat. I said things, Margaret continued, about the nature of your arrangement, about David. She paused. I was unkind, and I was wrong. You weren't entirely wrong about the arrangement, Sarah said. Margaret looked up. "When I walked into that feed store," Sarah said, "I was asking a stranger to help me save a piece of paper. That's the truth of it. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." She wrapped her hands around her cup. What I didn't know then was what kind of man I was asking, or what kind of arrangement it would become. Margaret was quiet. She had the look of a woman recalibrating, putting new information into old frames and finding the frames too small. "The whole town watched," Margaret said finally. "You know that." "I know." "And what they saw wasn't what any of us expected." "No," Sarah said. "It wasn't what I expected either." Margaret picked up her coffee, sipped it, set it down. "He stepped forward," she said, "that day at the hearing. When the railroad lawyer was trying to interrupt, David just stepped forward." "He does that," Sarah said. Something shifted in Margaret Hargrove's face. Something genuine, underneath the social calculation. Something that looked like a woman, recognizing the thing she understood. "Your father would have approved," she said. Sarah looked at her. "I know," she said. After Margaret left, with more warmth than she'd arrived with, which was its own small resolution, Sarah stood in the kitchen for a long moment. The farm was quiet in the way it got in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, when the work had a natural pause in it and everything seemed briefly suspended. She thought about what she'd said to Margaret, about not knowing what kind of man she'd been asking, about not knowing what the arrangement would become. She knew now. She'd been knowing for some time, if she was being honest, which she was trying to be. The problem was the honesty itself. Specifically, what to do with it. David was not a man who made things easy in the obvious ways. He didn't press. He didn't hint. He said what he meant when he'd made up his mind to say it, and not before. And he moved through every day with the patient certainty of a man who understood that the right things done in the right order tended to hold. She had always respected that. She was currently finding it spectacularly inconvenient. She thought about what he'd said on the sidewalk. "I'm working up to that part." She thought about the way his hand had gone to the back of her chair in the hearing room. She thought about Strawberry and Peach and a piece of land in Colorado he'd fought for alone and lost. She thought, "He is afraid of losing again." She thought, "So am I." The difference was that she had spent 47 acres of practical reason and legal maneuvering, and she'd come out on the other side of it with the land intact. And she'd done it by refusing to give ground when the pressure came. She was beginning to think the same principle applied here, that the worst thing she could do was retreat to practicality now, when the hard part was supposed to be finished. It was a Thursday evening when she decided that working up to things had an expiration date. David was on the porch. She came and sat beside him, the way she'd started to. Beside, not across, not opposite. He moved slightly to accommodate her, which he always did, which she had stopped pretending wasn't a specific kind of thing. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." He looked at her. In the 2 months she had known him, she had learned that this was the look of a man bracing himself for something he'd been expecting. "All right," he said again. "When this is over—" She stopped herself. "It is over. The legal part is over. When the arrangement reaches whatever its natural end is." She looked at him directly. "What do you want?" The silence had weight. "What do you mean?" he said carefully. "By the arrangement?" "You know what I mean." "I'd like you to say it plain," he said, "since you asked for honest." She held his gaze. "The marriage," she said. "The paper. What we built it on. When that stops being what holds us here." She didn't look away. What do you want to be left with? David set down the leatherwork in his hands. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down something he's been holding on to, because he needed something to do with his hands. Sarah, he said. David? I told you I was working up to something. You told me that 5 weeks ago. I know. That is a significant amount of working up to something. Something crossed his face. That thing she'd come to love. The crack and the careful quiet of him. The warmth that surprised him before he could decide whether to allow it. I lost a piece of land once because I fought alone, he said. I came to Millhaven because I needed somewhere to put myself that wasn't that place. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't ready to want something again. And then I walked into Callaway's feed store, she said. And then you walked into Callaway's feed store. He looked at her steady and said, I'll do like you were doing me a favor? I was doing you a favor, she said. Half the harvest income. Sarah. I know. She let the deflection go. I know. He turned to face her more fully. His voice was quieter now, but steadier, the tone he used when he decided completely. I don't want to dissolve anything, he said. I want the opposite of that. I want to sit on this porch in 10 years and still be here. And I want to know I didn't let the most stubborn, honest, decent woman I have ever met slip past me because I was afraid of being wrong again. He paused. That's what I want. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to be sure she was seeing clearly, and not just what she hoped to see. You're not wrong, she said, for what it's worth. It's worth a good deal, he said. The same words she'd used at the fence line, reflected back, deliberate. She understood that was his vow. She didn't have words adequate to the moment, so she did what she'd seen her father do, in the specific manner of people who mean what they do more than what they say. She offered her hand. Not the businesslike handshake of the courthouse steps, her hand, open, in the space between them. He looked at it. Then he took it. And he didn't shake it. He just held it, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, and that was all. And it was everything. They sat that way in the evening quiet, the farm settling into dusk around them, and neither spoke for a long while, because nothing needed saying that hadn't been said. The twist came the next morning, and it came from a direction neither of them had covered. The writer arrived before breakfast, a young man from the county clerk's office, formal and uncomfortable in the way of people delivering news they haven't been briefed to explain. He handed David a document, tipped his hat, left quickly. David read it standing in the doorway. Sarah watched his face, and her stomach went tight at what she saw move through it. Not the controlled processing she was used to, but something sharper, something older. What is it? She said. He handed it to her without speaking. It was a legal notice from the estate of a James Callaway Harris, filed in the Colorado Territory. It notified David James Harris that as the surviving party to a prior contract, a land agreement entered into in Mesa County, Colorado, in the year 1869, he was required to appear before the Mesa County Probate Court within 90 days to address unresolved claims against the property formerly registered in his name. Sarah read it twice. Then she looked up. James Callaway Harris, she said. My brother, David said. He sat down on the porch step, slowly, like a man whose legs had decided to have a separate conversation with gravity. My older brother. I haven't spoken to him in 8 years. He's dead. The notice says, estate. His voice was distant in the specific way of a person touching something they'd put away carefully and finding it hadn't stayed where they'd left it. That means he died. She sat down beside him. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say yet that wouldn't be reaching past what he needed. After a long moment, David said, "The property in Colorado, the 30 acres in the creek. When I lost the legal dispute, the neighbor who filed the boundary claim," he stopped. His name was Calvert Harris. He said the name was coincidence, that there was no relation. Another pause. I believed him because I needed to believe it. Because the alternative was that my own brother had filed a claim against me through a proxy and taken my land from under me while I was fighting it. The morning was very still. "David," she said. "I don't know that's what happened," he said. "I've told myself that for 8 years. I don't know." "But you've wondered." "Every day." He looked at the land in front of them. Her land, their land, the land they'd fought for together. "That's why I said yes in that feed store. Because I knew exactly what was being done to you. And I knew exactly what it felt like to stand at the end of it with nothing." She absorbed that. The full shape of it. 8 years of wondering, of not knowing, of carrying the weight of a loss that might have been a betrayal. 8 years of it, until a stranger walked in and asked him to fight the same battle with her. "You have to go," she said. He looked at her. "To Colorado," she said. "You have to find out." "It's 90 days. I know." "The farm will be here," she said. "I held it before. I'll hold it while you go find out what happened to yours." She held his gaze. "David, you told me to hold my father's land because that's all the answer I needed. I'm telling you, you need to know. You need to look at whatever is in that probate record and know, one way or the other." He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. "And if it's what I think," he said finally, "if James, then you grieve it properly," she said, "instead of carrying the wondering." He looked at her with something that she would have once called the beginning of love, and now recognized simply as love that had already arrived and was only now being allowed to call itself by its name. "You'd let me go," he said. "I'd make you go," she said. "There's a difference." "And when I come back." "When you come back," she said firmly, "not if." Something in him broke open then. Not dramatically, not with any performance. Just a quiet unraveling of something that had been held too tight for too long. Visible only in the way his shoulders changed, the way he exhaled, the way he looked at her like she'd handed him something he'd stopped believing was still available to receive. "I'll be back in 40 days, he said. "Take 45, she said, "in case the county records are slow." He almost smiled. "You'll be all right," he said. It was not entirely a question. "David," she said, "I married you in 11 minutes in a courthouse with a judge who'd seen everything twice. I fought a railroad and a county assessor and a Denver law office with 6 days' notice." She met his eyes. "I will be extraordinarily all right." The almost smile landed. "Yes," he said, "you will." He left 2 days later, at first light, with a packed bag and a horse, and the kind of quiet certainty she'd come to recognize as his version of a promise. She stood at the gate and watched him ride down the lane, and she did not feel the fear she'd expected. She felt something else. She felt like a woman who had built something worth coming back to, and had trusted it to hold. The farm was quiet around her. The south fence stood straight. The east boundary posts were clear. Both wells ran deep and clean. 47 acres of her father's work and her own, and 1 month's absence to fill before she could pick up where they'd left off. She went inside, put the coffee on, opened the ledger to a new page. She had a farm to run. The first week without him was the loudest silence Sarah had ever lived inside. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected the farm to feel the way it felt before. Self-contained, sufficient, hers. She'd run it alone for 6 months after her father died, and she'd done it without complaint and without company. And she'd been fine. She knew how to be fine. What she hadn't known, before David Harris, was the difference between being fine and being whole. Those turned out to be two entirely separate conditions, and she discovered the distance between them approximately 48 hours after his horse disappeared down the lane. She worked. That was the answer to most things, and it was the answer now. The south field needed tending. The east fence needed a section replaced, ironic given everything. And the well housing needed recalking before the late summer heat cracked it through. She rose at 5, ate at 6, worked until the light failed, ate again, and went to bed with the ledger, running numbers that didn't need running because she'd already run them, just to have something to do with her hands. Ruth Callan came by on Wednesday, sat at the kitchen table the way she always sat, like a woman who had decided the chair belonged to her and the room could argue if it liked. "You look tired," Ruth said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you looked tired." Ruth poured her own coffee without being asked. "Where is he?" "Colorado. 90 days. Legal matter." "How long has he been gone?" 8 days. Ruth looked at her with the precise expression of a woman who understood everything and had decided not to say most of it. "When does he come back?" "When it's done," Sarah said. "I told him 45 days. "And if it takes longer?" Sarah looked at her coffee. "It won't." Ruth made a sound that was not agreement and not disagreement, and contained all the wisdom of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and raised 4 children, and understood that certainty was mostly just hope with better posture. "He'll come back," Ruth said. Not a comfort, a statement of fact, delivered with the bluntness of a woman who didn't waste reassurance on things she didn't believe. "I know," Sarah said. She did know. That was the strange and unfamiliar thing about it. Not the fear that he wouldn't return, but the certainty that he would, and the weight of that certainty, and the understanding that she had allowed herself to count on something again. She had not counted on anything since her father died. She'd forgotten how exposed it made you feel. How alive. The letter arrived on the 14th day. Not from David, from Price. Short, 2 paragraphs, the kind of letter Price wrote when he was delivering news that required no editorial commentary. Gerald Holt had resigned from the county assessor's office. The land office examination had concluded that the complaint against the Miller property had been filed in bad faith, using county authority for the benefit of a private commercial entity. The formal record had been amended. Holt's name was attached to those findings permanently. And the second paragraph, which Price had written with the careful understatement of a man who understood that some victories needed to be handed to a person quietly, without crowd or ceremony. The Southwestern Territorial Railroad Consortium had withdrawn its interest in the Eastern Ridge Corridor entirely. A different route had been selected. The Miller Wells, the eastern acreage, the land her father had broken his back to build. None of it was on anyone's map anymore. Sarah read the letter at the kitchen table, read it again, folded it along its creases and held it in both hands, and let herself feel the full shape of what had happened. It was over. All of it. Not just the title dispute, not just the hearing. The whole machinery that had been built against her, quietly, over months she hadn't known she was being watched. It was over, and the land was hers, clear and uncontested and safe. She thought about her father, about the way he'd looked at this farm like it was a living thing he was in conversation with. She thought about the summer he'd told her that some things are worth more than winning. They're worth protecting. That protection was love, with its sleeves rolled up. She set the letter down on the table beside the ledger. She thought about David in Colorado, reading records she hadn't seen, standing in a courthouse in Mesa County with 8 years of unanswered questions, and whatever he'd find at the end of them. She thought about how he'd looked when she told him to go. Not relieved, not grateful. Something more complicated. Like a man being handed back a part of himself he'd stopped believing he deserved to reclaim. She hoped he was all right. She set herself back to work, because that was what there was to do. And she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did not sit still when there was ground to tend. Randall Mott found her at the general store on Friday, with an expression she'd learned to read. Careful neutrality over the top of something he'd decided she needed to know. "Heard from Bill Deaver this morning," he said, sliding her order across the counter. "He came through from San Antonio. Said there's word on the wire. About the railroad." "What kind of word?" "The consortium's legal representative." Randall kept his voice low and even, the way he did everything. "The one at the hearing, young fellow, sharp suit. I remember him. He resigned the day after the land office ruling. Left the consortium entirely." Randall paused. "Word is, he's the one who submitted the internal documentation to the land office examiner. The record of what the consortium authorized Holt to do." Sarah went still. "He turned on them." "Seems so." Randall stacked 2 cans of peaches on the counter beside her order, deliberate and unhurried. Some men, when they see the direction a thing is going, decide they'd rather be on the right side of it. She looked at the cans of peaches. Then she looked at Randall. "Thank you," she said. "Just filling your order," he said. But his eyes were warm, and he didn't charge her for the peaches. Day 31. The letter came from David. She sat on the porch to read it, in the early morning before the heat settled in, and she read it the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, all the way through, without skipping ahead. He'd found the records, all of them. The Mesa County boundary dispute, the proxy claim filed by a man named Calvert Harris, who had, in fact, been paid through a third party connected to James Calloway Harris's estate. His brother. The thing he'd suspected for 8 years had been true, and the probate record had laid it out in the colorless language of legal documentation, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. James Harris had died without children, without a wife, and with a considerable amount of guilt attached to his name in the form of an unexecuted codicil to his will. A document he'd drafted 2 years before his death and never filed, which would have returned the Colorado property to David and included a written acknowledgement of what had been done. He'd known. He'd intended to make it right. He'd run out of time. David had written this part of a letter in shorter sentences than the rest of it. Sarah read the space between those sentences as carefully as the words themselves, and understood what it cost him to put it down plain. The rest of the letter was practical. The probate court had no claim on him. The original property had been sold twice over and was unrecoverable. But the estate owed him back wages under the original contract terms, a sum that was not large, but was not nothing. He'd arranged for Price to handle the receipt of it. He'd been to his brother's grave. He didn't say what he'd said there, and she didn't need him to. He was coming home, not in 45 days, in 12. She folded the letter and held it in her lap, and looked at the farm in the morning quiet. And she did something she had not done since the morning her father died. She let herself cry, fully and without apology. Not from grief, from the particular exhaustion of a long fight finally finished, and the particular relief of knowing that the person she'd been holding the door open for was on his way back through it. She did not cry long. She was, fundamentally, a practical woman, and there was work to do. But she cried. He arrived on a Tuesday in the late afternoon, and she was at the south fence when she heard the horse. She knew the sound of his horse. She hadn't realized she'd cataloged it until she heard it, and her whole body recognized it before her mind caught up. She set down the fence tool in her hand and turned around. David Harris rode down the lane the way he always did everything, without hurry, without performance, like a man who trusted that where he was going would still be there when he arrived. He dismounted at the gate, tied the horse, and walked across the field toward her, and she stood and let him come, because she needed a moment to settle the thing happening in her chest into something she could stand upright with. He stopped in front of her. He looked tired in the way long travel makes a person tired, and something in his face was different. Not damaged, not broken, but the way a person looks after they've set down a weight they carried so long they forgot it was separate from them. "You're back early," she said. "I'm back," he said, like that was the only relevant part. She looked at him. He looked at her. The summer evening pressed around them, warm and honest, and neither of them had any more working up to do. "Did you find what you needed to find?" she said. "Yes." A pause. "It was what I thought." "I know. I got your letter." He nodded, was quiet a moment. "I went to his grave," he said. "I know that too." "I don't know that I forgive him." He said it carefully, the way he said things he'd decided to say completely. "But I said what I had to say, and I left it there. And I got on the horse and came south." He looked at her. "That's what I had." "That's enough," she said. He exhaled, slow, deliberate, the whole weight of Mesa County and 8 years of wondering leaving him in a single breath. "The farm looks good," he said. "The farm is excellent," she said. "Price wrote. Holt is out. The railroad dropped the corridor. It's done, David. All of it." Something moved in his face. The sum of everything. The hearing, the letters, the web offer, the survey crew, the 11 minutes in front of Judge Albee, the hand she'd offered at the courthouse steps, the hand he'd taken on the porch. All of it, arriving in his expression at once. "You held it," he said. "We held it," she said. "You were still on the deed while you were gone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't want to be on the deed as an arrangement." "I know." "I want to be on it because this is where I live, because this is mine, and yours, and ours." He held her gaze without flinching. "I want to be on it because I'm asking you, clearly, plainly, no working up to it, to let this be real." She didn't make him wait. "It's already real," she said. "It's been real since you said strawberry and meant peach." The crack in him, that warm, surprise thing she loved best about him, finally broke all the way through. The smile landed, full and unguarded, and she thought she could count on one hand the number of times she'd seen David Harris look like this. And she intended to spend considerable effort increasing that number. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it." "You fix the north section of the barn roof before September. It's been a problem since April, and I've been managing it with buckets and patience, and I have run out of patience." He looked at the barn, back at her. "That's your condition." "It's a significant roof section." "Sarah." "David." He shook his head once, slow, the way a man shakes his head at something that has entirely defeated his ability to maintain a serious face. Then he stepped forward, the same step she'd watched him take toward Gerald Holt on the porch, toward the railroad lawyer in the hearing room, unhurried and certain, and closing the distance between where he was and where he intended to be. He put his hands on either side of her face. looked at her the way he looked at things he'd decided completely. No edges, no reservations, nothing held back. "I'll fix the roof," he said. "Good," she said. And then he kissed her, in the middle of the south field, on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, with the farm all around them and the sky wide open overhead. And it was not a dramatic kiss, not a performance. It was the kiss of two people who had been working toward each other, through legal disputes and county hearings and Colorado probate courts, and 11 minutes before a judge who'd seen everything twice, and had finally, with no more obstacles between them, arrived. Ruth Callan came by on Thursday, which Sarah had expected. She looked at them both across the kitchen table, looked at the way David refilled Sarah's coffee before his own, at the way Sarah passed the bread without being asked, at the particular quality of the silence between two people who have stopped having to explain themselves to each other. And she nodded once, slow, with the satisfaction of a woman whose read of a situation had proven correct. "Well," Ruth said. "Don't," Sarah said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were organizing a speech." Ruth smiled into her coffee. "How's the north roof section?" David looked up from across the table. "How did you know about the roof?" "I know everything that happens on this farm," Ruth said. "I knew your father, child. I've been watching this place for 30 years. She set down her cup. "I'm glad it's in good hands." She meant both of them. She didn't have to clarify. After Ruth left, Randall Mott stopped by with a delivery Sarah hadn't ordered. A case of peach preserves, 12 jars, placed on the porch step with a note that said only, "Heard the news. Well done." No signature, because Randall Mott had never seen the point of signing things that were obvious. David picked up one of the jars, looked at it, looked at Sarah. "Peach," he said. "Don't make a thing of it," she said. He set it down very carefully. His expression was the specific one she was beginning to collect, like her father had collected evidence of a good harvest. Stored carefully, returned to often. Proof that something worth keeping was growing. In the weeks that followed, Millhaven recalibrated, the way small towns do, not with announcements or apologies, but with a quiet revision of the official story. Gerald Holt became, in the town's collective memory, a cautionary figure rather than an authority. The railroad corridor became something people talked about as the thing that hadn't happened, with the specific pride of a community that believed it had resisted something, though most of them had been watching from a distance while two people did the actual resisting. Margaret Hargrove brought peach preserves of her own 2 weeks after Randall's, which Sarah considered a small but genuine act of grace, and accepted accordingly. Price wrote in September to confirm the final disposition of the land office matter. Holt's conduct had been formally censured. The county had appointed a new assessor, a woman named Clara Hayes, 41 years old, with a background in agricultural law, which was either a coincidence or a small act of justice by someone with the power to make appointments. Sarah chose to believe the latter. The barn roof was fixed by the end of August. David did it in 4 days, methodically and thoroughly. And when the first September rain came through and the bucket stayed dry, Sarah stood in the barn and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem finally solved by someone who knew what they were doing. She found him that evening at the kitchen table, the ledger open between them, her father's ledger, with its 30 years of cramped, honest figures, and the new pages in her own handwriting, and now, in the last column, David's numbers alongside hers, in his plain, deliberate script. She stood in the doorway and looked at that for a moment. The two kinds of handwriting on the same page, the way the columns fit together, not because one had been adapted to the other, but because they'd found the same rhythm naturally, the way two people find a shared walking pace without discussing it. "You changed the harvest projections," she said. "South Field's running better than you had it," he said. "New estimates conservative, but I think it holds." She came and sat beside him. He moved the ledger slightly toward her without looking up. She looked at the numbers. He was right, which she'd expected. "My father used to sit here for hours," she said, "going over the same columns. I used to think it was worry. Now I think it was just how he talked to the farm." David looked at the ledger. What did it say back? She thought about it. That it was worth the trouble, she said. Every time. Worth every hard year and every bad season and every morning that came before the good one. He looked at her then, steady and complete and entirely present, the way he always was. "He was right," David said. "He usually was," she said. "It was irritating." David's mouth moved, full, unguarded. The smile she'd been collecting. She leaned her head against his shoulder, briefly, the way a person leans against something they trust to hold their weight. Without thought, without ceremony. Because it was where she wanted to be, and he was there, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole sum of it. Outside, the September evening came in slow and mild, the brutal summer finally spent, the air carrying the first faint suggestion of a season turning. The farm was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when everything was right. Not empty, but settled, fed, held. Sarah Miller, Sarah Harris, had walked into a feed store on a desperate Thursday, with nothing but a legal problem and a name she needed. She had walked out with more than she'd known to ask for. More than she'd believed was still available to a woman who'd buried her father and her certainty in the same summer. She had held her father's land. She had built something of her own. And she had learned, in the space of one impossible season, that the most practical decision she'd ever made had turned out to be the truest one. That the man she'd chosen to save a deed had become the man she would choose again, every morning, for every reason that had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with who they'd become in the fighting of it. The pretend marriage had done what pretend things sometimes do when two honest people are inside them long enough. It had become the realest thing either of them had ever had.